at the Worcester branch of the Wayne County Public Library. So today we would like to share with you some of the audiobooks we've been listening to that are written by women, about women, and probably some good historical stuff in there. So, without further ado, would you like to start or do you want me to start?
I can start.
All right.
So I recently read The Rose Code. It is by Kate Quinn. So she's the one who wrote The Alice Network, which is also a fabulous book. So this was narrated by Saskia, oh boy, this is Dutch, Marlevid, and she was wonderful. So this is the story of three women at Bletchley Park, which, if you know the story of Alan Turing, that's where he worked during World War II. So it kind of goes through the three women. Their names are Osla, Mab, and Beth, and how they came to be code breakers at Bletchley Park. Now, Osla is great. She comes from a really wealthy family, and she gets teased about being a debutante. So she was really amusing to get her point of view during the book. And she also has a boyfriend, and he is a exiled Greek prince that we all know and love, and that is Prince Charles before he... Was that his name? The one who's married to Queen Elizabeth.
Prince Philip.
Prince Philip,
Yeah.
yes. And, so he kind of has this guest role. And he really did, in real life, have a girlfriend before he married Queen Elizabeth. So it's kind of a fun little bit of history. So I really enjoyed it because not only were all of these women, like, super strong, and they all had their own really cool personalities, but... the book also really shows how women were viewed during the 1940s, and the one character actually gets a little overwhelmed by some of the events going on, and then on top of that, there's maybe someone scheming against her. I'm not going to give away spoilers, but she ends up in an insane asylum. And you know that from the beginning of the book, so I'm not giving anything away there, but, just how much things have changed since then. And the women at Bletchley Park were actually treated really well. They were treated like equals, more or less. But there's a reason why we all know about Alan Turing more than we know about some of these other women. And this book is based off of the stories of several actual women who worked at Bletchley Park cracking the Enigma machines. So, yeah.
That sounds really interesting, Katie. So I'm going to go back a little further in history. And the book that I've chosen is American Duchess by Karen Harper. It's set from around 1893 to around 1940 because it's covering the adult life of Consuelo Vanderbilt, who was the daughter of the wealthy William and Alva Vanderbilt, who were really big on the Nouveau Riche scene.
Mm-hmm.
And she is married off at age 18, even though she's madly in love with this American named Win Rutherford. She's married off to the Duke of Marlborough. So basically, she's one of those dollar heiresses that went from America to England during the Gilded Age. Now, the Duke of Marlborough, who's called Sonny in the book, that was his nickname based on one of his other titles, lived at Blenheim Palace and was actually cousin to Winston Churchill.
Okay.
So you get a lot of the history of the time in there, and you see how Consuelo was friends with Winston and how then she gets involved with a lot of the goings-on at that time. But it really depicts her as not only active in politics, but also in charities, because, she comes across as this heiress, and this is the tradition she's been brought up in, that you support charities. And since her husband's really only concerned about making his palace the grand place it's supposed to be, she's like, well, I've got other things I want to be doing. They actually don't have a very happy marriage. They did have a couple of children, and they separated in 1906, divorced in 1921, and then she went on to marry another man she had fallen in love with, who was a French hot air balloonist.
Oh, cool.
So, it follows the outlines of her life pretty closely. It's just described and then narrated in a way that's more fictionalized, that you get more conversation, even though it's based on letters and everything else. So it's one of those books that is really going to appeal to people who like Downton Abbey and shows like that. So it's like kind of that British aristocracy costume drama, but more modern. It's really interesting.
Nice.
It's only about 9 hours long for a read, and it goes pretty quickly. So it was
that book sounds fabulous. Well, and another one that I read that you might also enjoy is Clark and Division. So it just came out last year. It is by Naomi Hirahara. And this was narrated by Alison Hiroto, and it takes place in Chicago, and our main character is Aki. She and her family have just been let out of a Japanese internment camp. Now, they're from California, where her father ran his own grocery business, but obviously they've lost all of that, and her sister left a few months before they get to, and has set up an apartment for the whole family in Chicago. So they're headed to Chicago. She's very excited to get back with her sister, Rose. And then they learn, literally the day before they arrive, that her sister is dead. And not only did her sister die, and this is a woman in her young 20s, so not only did her sister pass away, but the police are saying she committed suicide. And Aki knows that her sister would never do that, especially with like the family coming so soon. So the rest of the book then is Aki's investigation. Makes a few friends. She actually gets a job at a library, so kind of love that. But just kind of a really unique look at what life was like for Japanese folks in the late 1940s. She deals with racist cops. She also deals with a nice cop, at least, dealing with being perceived as, just Japanese, and the fear that some people still have in the neighborhood, but then also being able to, make close friends. It was a really lovely book. And then, of course, she uses her detective skills to really figure out what happens. And I enjoyed it quite a bit.
I know there have been a number of books that have come out in recent years addressing that time in history and the internment of Japanese Americans. But most of the ones that I've come across have dealt with life in the camps, not life after. So that sounds like it would be worth it.
Yes.
Definitely. Well, since we've been looking mostly at 20th century or late 19th century, I'm going to take us way back with this next book. And that book is Matrix by Lauren Groff. It's also historical fiction, but this one is set in a time frame between about 1158 and the early 1200s. I'm not talking time, I'm talking years here. So this goes way back to medieval England, and it follows the life of a poet of noble birth questioning that noble birth because she was a bastard. The woman's name was Marie de France, and she was sent away from the English court of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, sent to an impoverished English abbey at the age of 17, just sent off because the queen didn't want her around, she wasn't attractive.
What they did back then.
Right. She was one of those useless women. So she was sent off as a novice, and over the years, she, gained some power in the abbey and eventually became the prioress. there's a lot of questions in terms of the real history about this figure, what her real name was, who her parents were. So this book is really kind of building up a potential history, not true history necessarily. But it really shows how Marie learned, starting with Eleanor and then her time in the Abbey, that, quote, a woman's power exists only as far as she is allowed. So definitely a time period where if women wanted to have power, they really had to find ways to get it. It was not an easy way to do it. It's really a beautifully written book, very slow plot, but it's beautifully written, and the audiobook is narrated by one of my favorite narrators, Adjoa Andoh, who I talked about a couple months ago as, she's the actress who's now known for her role as Lady Danbury in the Netflix show Bridgerton. But she reads it with, so many different accents and voices and such warmth that you just kind of sit back and relax into the book and you just get lost in it. It's really nice. It's almost 9 hours long. It's not really a very long book, but it's just this wonderful screenshot, if you will, of this time in history when women didn't really make the headlines unless they were queens or something. And this woman made an impact.
But I think a lot of historical fiction ends up in World War II or like the Civil War era. So it's always nice to get one that is maybe even from a time period that we don't normally see.
Right.
So what else did you read?
There was one bit of nonfiction that I actually read. That's not something I usually go for on audiobooks, but this is a book that I've been meaning to read for several years and just finally decided, okay, let's do it. And that is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. So it's a combination of biography and science because if you don't know the story, there was a woman named Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman who lived in Maryland, I believe, near Baltimore, who died in 1951 from cervical cancer. And those cancer cells were taken and allowed to grow into what they called immortality because they kept on producing new cells. And this was the first time that scientists had been able to get human cells to continue reproducing indefinitely, really. So the book is based on interviews with the Lacks family, especially the daughter. It really goes into a history of medical experimentation on Black Americans that we're now learning more and more about in recent years. And it explains the history of those particular HeLa cells, how they were used, the different things that were discovered or developed because of them. For example, that led to gene therapy, monoclonal antibodies, which we've heard a lot about the past year or two, used to treat polio, cancer, to test the effects of nuclear bombs and space on humans. I mean, after these cells were taken and used that first year or so in the lab, and scientists were saying, we have immortal cells now, then scientists from around the world were asking for and getting some of these cells to do their own research. But, the family was left not really knowing what happened and getting absolutely no compensation for what was taken. So it's a really, really interesting book in that it goes through some of the positive, but also some of the negative of this whole incident. The audiobook is longer. It's about 12 and a half hours long, but it really pulls you in because it goes from this history of the family and how Henrietta developed her symptoms and how she was treated and what happened with the family, balanced with then what happened with the cells as well. So it brings up a lot of good points, a lot of good questions about bioethics.
Yeah.
And you can really see why this book took off after it was published, looks like 2011. So over a decade ago, and it's still got a lot of relevance for today. So I'm glad I picked that one up and listened.
I haven't seen it, but I happen to know that they made a movie of that book as well with Oprah Winfrey. Well, thank you for joining us for Listening Librarians. If you like audiobooks, let us know in the comments what you're currently listening to. Next month, we will be coming with some mythology books.